I spent most of my childhood in a bubble of solitude, and as I look back now, those years feel like a different world altogether. Growing up an only child in a quiet suburban neighborhood meant that my days often floated by with just me, my thoughts, and a few loyal companions in the form of imaginary friends. It wasn't until I was in high school that I really began to notice how different I was from the other kids. While they raved about sibling rivalries and shared birthday parties, I mostly had memories of building elaborate blanket forts alone or losing myself in vast, fantastical stories spun from my overactive imagination. It felt almost like a badge of honor, until it didn't. When I met Sarah, my first real friend, in the spring of junior year, things shifted. She was boisterous and full of life, the kind of person who could spark laughter in the dullest of moments. One crisp afternoon, as we were lounging on the grass after school, she turned to me with an amused look and asked, "So, what's it like being an only child?" My cheeks flushed. I had never really thought about it before, never really questioned how it might look to others. I shrugged and joked, "I'm basically a lone wolf, thriving in my solitude, hoping my nonchalance covered my discomfort." But as our friendship deepened, I realized this perception became a topic of curious discussion. To Sarah and our circle of friends, I was the odd one out, and eventually, they began to label all my little quirks, my need for silence, my aversion to crowded places, my compulsive organizing. They teased me gently, asking if I ever felt like I was missing out on something vital by growing up without siblings, weaving a narrative that sent little ripples of discomfort through my chest. I started to examine my world more critically. Anxiety tugged at the corners of my mind like a persistent shadow. Was I really missing out? Had my quiet upbringing somehow stunted my capacity for connection? Those thoughts spiraled in me, building a tension I couldn't shake. In a moment of vulnerability, I admitted my fears about not fitting in to Sarah one day during lunch. I braced for reassurance, but all she gave me was a confused look. "It's not that serious," she said lightly, picking at her salad. "Being an only child just means you didn't have to learn how to share." It was said in jest, but the laughter that followed hung uncomfortably in the air, like the awkward silence that often enveloped me at family gatherings. The words replayed in my mind, a constant reminder of the perceived limitations my upbringing carried. It wasn't until weeks later, during a late-night conversation filled with soft whispers and secrets, that I found clarity. As the stars twinkled outside Sarah's window, we spoke about dreams, fears, and the silent battles we all faced. It was then that I realized being an only child didn't frame me in a box, it simply added to the collage of who I was becoming. I had learned independence in a way that others hadn't. I had cultivated a rich inner life that allowed me to empathize deeply, to share pieces of myself that were raw and real. By the time summer rolled around, I began to embrace my differences. I no longer felt stifled by the perception of what an only child meant. Instead, I wore it as a unique element of my identity. The teasing from friends became affectionate ribbing rather than painful reminders, and I found joy in explaining my quirks to new people I met. It was silly, almost freeing, to clarify things like my peculiar love for quiet coffee shops or my habit of organizing my bookshelves by color, little nuances that made me, me. In some ways, I imagine that everyone had their own singularities, and mine were simply born from a different start. Maybe they reinforced my strengths instead of my weaknesses. I think back on that time fondly, remembering how it shaped my adult relationships. Connecting with others became a deliberate act, a choice to share my thoughts and feelings instead of hiding behind them. I discovered that vulnerability was not a sign of weakness but an invitation to deeper connections. The laughter shifted, it turned from gentle teasing to understanding camaraderie, and instead of seeing me as the solitary figure, my friends began to see the depth of my inner world. And now, as I share this story, I recognize that each uniqueness tells a larger narrative, the stories we all carry through life, boundlessly weaving with those around us. Even now, I sometimes yearn for that comforting solitude of my childhood, the solace of quiet reflection, but it was ultimately the connections I forged that opened the door to understanding myself better. It turns out, growing up alone in a crowded world taught me how to truly relate to others, to appreciate the vibrant tapestry of human experience that connects us all, and I've learned that it's not always about sharing a childhood, sometimes, it's about sharing a journey. And as for Sarah? Well, she's still my best friend, and we often reminisce about those carefree days, realizing how those silly conversations about sibling relationships sparked something profound in both of us. Update: a few months later, I saw a post on social media by Sarah asking, "What's something you learned about yourself that surprised you?" I responded, "Being an only child taught me more about connection than I ever realized." It received many comments, and people shared their own stories, forming a rich conversation. I couldn't help but smile at how the thread weaves together our different experiences into one collective narrative. Scrolling through the comments on that post, I felt a warmth swell in my chest, realizing how deeply our experiences intertwined. Each reply was a unique thread in the tapestry of human connection, beautifully illustrating how our diverse backgrounds shaped us in myriad ways. It was there, beneath the haze of glowing screens, that I caught a glimpse of a broader truth. My life had been influenced by an apparent isolation, growing up without siblings, which now seemed to blossom into an empathetic understanding of others seeking connection. Sarah and I had often joked about the quirks I exhibited, my compulsive need to organize things, my tendency to take up a lot of the conversational space, and my sometimes awkward attempts at humor that felt like they needed an audience. Yet these traits didn't just define me, they had formed bridges to my friends, especially to her. As if she sensed my wandering thoughts, Sarah texted me later that evening, "Let's grab coffee tomorrow. I feel like we both have a lot to share." Over lattes and warm croissants, we picked up right where our shared online discussions left off, transforming abstract experiences into tangible conversations loaded with laughter and revelations. Our familiarity felt like a blanket on a cold night, comforting and secure. Seeing Sarah's animated gestures as she recounted her own misadventures of self-discovery made me realize how different yet similar our paths were. She spoke of the chaos of growing up with siblings, how they often bickered yet remained inseparable, a bond forged in the fires of familial dynamics. There was an enviable freedom in her siblings' ability to spar over petty things until a simple moment of laughter could dissolve the tension in mere seconds. In our conversations, I often considered how my solitude had cultivated independence in me, yet I could feel this quiet yearning for kinship that had simmered below the surface, nurturing my desire for connection in unexpected ways. It became clear that while we had grown up in different settings, the quest for belonging was fundamentally universal. Toward the end of our coffee date, as we sipped the last dregs of our drinks, Sarah posed a question that seemed innocuous but struck a deep chord within me. "Do you think being an only child opened or closed doors for you?" I paused, stirring the remnants of milk in my cup, searching for the right words. "Both, I think. It's opened doors to understanding and appreciating the depth of relationships, but sometimes I wonder if it also closed off the type of spontaneity that siblings provide." Her eyes lit with understanding. "I get that. It's like we took two different paths through the same woods." Driving home, the afternoon sun dipped low, casting a golden glow through the trees, swirling leaves dancing in the air. I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. My heart swelled, no longer tethered by the solitude of my upbringing but buoyed by the connections I had forged in adulthood, the friends who accepted me for all my quirks. Reflecting on that coffee date, I realized it wasn't just about siblings or being an only child, it was about embracing the uniqueness of our individual journeys while recognizing a shared goal of longing to belong. Curiously, I decided to update my original response on Sarah's post with this realization, as I sensed it would resonate with others as well. "It's funny, isn't it?" I wrote, "how our upbringings mold us, but we realize the essence of connection lies in understanding ourselves and each other, regardless of whether we grew up alone or surrounded by siblings." As the notifications buzzed in, echoing my sentiments back at me, I could almost feel the community's collective warmth enveloping me, reminding me that whether we came from large families or were raised in the quiet corners of solitude, we each held a crucial part of the puzzle that formed our shared humanity. The realization dawned on me, the connections might just be the threads that bind us all, stitching together a narrative richer than our individual stories alone ever could, and perhaps in that, I found my own peace, nestled comfortably in a world that felt just a little bit more connected. That evening, as I put away my phone and took a moment to sit in the cozy glow of my living room, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I had always loved the silence of my childhood home, filled only with my thoughts, the pages of a book turning, and the occasional laughter between my parents, a serene bubble of love and warmth that sheltered me from the outside world. But now, I found myself marveling at how that quiet solitude had not limited my ability to connect, rather, it had nurtured a deep sense of empathy within me, one that allowed me to reach out and bridge the vastness that sometimes felt so isolating. The conversations we shared in the comment thread, that digital tapestry, reminded me of my late-night talks with Sarah, the way we dissected life's little intricacies and laughed over the absurdities we encountered. Sarah had sent me a message earlier that afternoon, suggesting we grab coffee soon to catch up, and I felt a flutter of excitement at the thought. I remembered a time when I might have hesitated, concerned that my world of one had somehow stifled my ability to engage, but not now. I wanted that connection, craved it even, like wildflowers stretching toward the sun. The next day was warm and inviting, and as I walked into the charming cafe where we had agreed to meet, I could already see her through the window, her animated hand softly punctuating her words as she spoke to someone behind the counter. It struck me then, how much she had become a part of my narrative, her own stories, filled with the noise of siblings and family dinners, weaving seamlessly into the quiet moments I had grown so accustomed to. We hugged tightly when we finally met, a rush of warmth reminding me that these moments were what I had been missing. We found a nook in the corner, the scent of freshly brewed coffee surrounding us like a comforting blanket. As we settled in, I couldn't help but reflect on the beauty of our friendship. It was a blend of her boisterous tales, filled with the chaos of siblings, balancing the stillness of my own upbringing. Our discussions flowed effortlessly, touching upon everything from our childhood moments to the recent posts we had engaged with on social media, each revelation feeling like a gentle shift in the pieces of a puzzle that was finally fitting together. As Sarah went on about her younger brother's latest antics, a sense of peace washed over me. Listening to her laugh, her eyes sparkling with details, I felt an undeniable bond forming, one that was neither defined by the number of siblings we had nor the homes we grew up in, but rather by our willingness to be present, to engage with one another's worlds. It was an understanding that transcended our physical realities and all the little insecurities that came with them. We talked about our careers, our dreams, and even our fears. I shared how I had often worried about being perceived as self-centered or introverted, but Sarah's response was a grounding reminder that traits were merely facets in a spectrum of our personalities, and it was how we chose to navigate the world that truly defined us. Later that week, sparked by our conversation, I decided to share my experience with solitude and connection on my social media. I posted a reflective piece about how growing up without siblings taught me the art of nurturing and craving connection in a world that often felt distant. To my surprise, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. It was as if I had pulled the thread of vulnerability, and suddenly, everyone was weaving their own stories into mine. Those with siblings spoke of how they valued their relationships, while others shared the struggles of being an only child, echoing similar sentiments to what I had experienced. Each comment felt like a gentle tug at the fabric of our shared reality, a tapestry of laughter, tears, and understanding. By the end of the week, the post had sparked long threads of conversations, bringing together a community of voices, tales of connection and solitude simmering in the warm glow of shared empathy. As I tucked myself in bed that night, I reflected on how remarkable it was that our seemingly separate lives had the potential to intertwine, drawing us closer as we sought deeper connections. I felt a new chapter opening in my life, one where I could embrace both the quiet spaces I cherished and the vibrant voices of others. Perhaps this was the true gift of growing up as an only child. It didn't isolate me, it prepared me to appreciate the beauty of human connection in all its forms. Maybe, just maybe, the absence of siblings had equipped me with the ability to cultivate friendships that were, in their own right, as close as family. And with that comforting thought, I drifted off to sleep, dreaming of the conversations yet to be had, and the threads of connection yet to be woven in the intricate tapestry of life. I never imagined that a single night could unravel so much of my carefully constructed life, but there I was, standing in my dimly lit kitchen, stomach churning with panic as I replayed the events of the evening over and over in my mind. It all began as any ordinary Saturday. I was at home, enjoying a quiet evening after a grueling week at the office, feeling the weight of the world lift just a little as I prepared to indulge in my favorite comfort food, macaroni and cheese. I was halfway through boiling the pasta when I heard an urgent knock at my door. My heart raced. It was unusual for anyone to visit me unannounced, especially this late. When I opened the door, my neighbor, Sarah, stood there, her breathing heavy, face pale, and hair disheveled. She had always been the burst of energy on our otherwise quiet street, but tonight she looked like a ghost, trembling and wide-eyed. "We need to get inside, now," she whispered, pulling me into her apartment without waiting for a response. Before I could grasp the situation, her hand motioned to the window where I saw fear reflecting in her eyes as she explained something I could barely comprehend. She spoke of some chemical cloud that had emerged from the abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, claiming it was dangerous, potentially life-threatening. I could almost feel the air grow denser around us, but I was skeptical. It seemed bizarre and conjured images of a poorly written horror flick. Yet, the urgency in her voice cracked through my layers of disbelief, and I could see she was genuinely frightened. It wasn't long before the acrid smell wafted in through the window, causing immediate dread to claw at my chest. I had learned a little about chemistry in college. I knew enough to also understand that some poisons can fester without notice, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach as I shut the window and joined her on the couch, trying to piece together what we should do. As time passed in silence, the tension rapidly escalated. Outside, the muted chaos of sirens wailed in the distance, mingling with Sarah's quiet whimpers. I could tell she was spiraling. Despite my best efforts to reassure her, her breathing quickened, and soon I felt it too. The anxiety swirling in the room felt palpable. I propped up my phone on the coffee table, searching for updates or guidance from local news, anything to anchor us in reality, but then my fingers hesitated over a pop-up ad flashing on the screen. It was a promotional video for a new detoxification product that claimed to counteract chemical exposure. It was ridiculous of me to even consider it, but desperation does strange things to rational thought, and before long I had taken a deep breath and waded further into that dark abyss of misjudgment. "Let's try it," I suggested, wrestling through the lump in my throat. Sarah stared at me, her eyes wide and glossy, and for a moment, I thought she would refuse, but then that fear flickered, and with it, a look of agreement washed over her face. We knew it could be a scam, we knew that it could be even worse than doing nothing, but there we were, both of us grasping for anything that offered hope. We mixed the strange powder into water, the eerie fluorescent green swirling into a murky blend. With shaking hands, we divided the concoction between us and downed it, the taste nearly bile-like, and much to my horror, I could feel a knot of guilt twisting inside me. Soon after we drank it, reality blurred against the rising terror of what we'd done, along with what was happening outside in our town. Perhaps I should have called someone, or maybe we could have just stayed indoors, but that ill-fated choice only paved the way for more panic. The minutes dragged on, and suddenly Sarah bolted for the bathroom, retching and wailing in horror. My heart pounded violently against my ribcage. I watched her in a disoriented state, confused about whether I should comfort her or be terrified of what the potion had done. She came back, crumpled on the floor, flushed and sweaty, and I could see the blame settling between us, thick like poison itself. I wanted to scream at her for suggesting it, she wanted to scream at me for going along with it. The reality of what we had done set like cold cement in my stomach, the dread consuming every ounce of rational thought. Nothing felt right anymore, and in that moment of chaos, I lost control. In an outburst fueled by fear, I vented what I really thought about her and the mess we had just dived into. My words came out like daggers, slicing through the air, and as soon as they left my lips, I regretted them. "This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't come over looking for help," I shouted, horrified by the vitriol I directed at someone who, moments ago, I would have called my friend. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the weight of my accusation smashing into her thin frame, and for a moment, I felt the world still around us. I hated how quickly I had attacked her, and yet I couldn't untangle the worry that had transformed into resentment so quickly, nor could I undo the hurt that painted her face. As the panic surged around us, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the potion and the night's chaos were somehow intertwined, leaving everything spiraling beyond our control. I reached down to apologize, to reclaim the fragile bond we had before this all began, but the doorbell rang, and before I could react, Sarah fled to answer it, her fear conflating with urgency. I stood alone in the swirling mix of regret and anxiety, unable to voice the torment that pressed down on me as I listened to the voice of a paramedic outside, growing concerned about our unfamiliar reaction. I found solace in the idea of absolution, the hope that admitting what had happened would mend the frayed seams of the night. Ultimately, the shadows of my panic, my loud accusations, and the desperate measures we took wrapped around me like a heavy fog. Now, as I stand, looking at the aftermath of my words echoing into the late-night stillness, I know I must confront what I did, hoping that my confessions could provide some insight into the fragile line we walk when fear bleeds into blame. No update for now, this is where I leave it, a story unraveled but not finished. As I stood there, bathed in the muted glow of the streetlights, the last remnants of the panic-induced adrenaline began to fade from my body, leaving behind a dull ache in my chest. I could still hear Anna's voice piercing through the chaos, the way she cried for help and how the tension in the air tightened around us like a noose. It was a knife's edge we danced upon, teetering between vulnerability and paranoia. The events had spiraled so quickly, it felt surreal, like a fever dream I couldn't wake up from. Moments before the sirens had shared their chilling song with us, it was just another Friday night, a few drinks after work, laughter echoing through our modest apartment as Anna and I sat on our worn-out couch, sharing embarrassing stories from our years together. Things turned sinister fast, though, when a strange smell wafted in from our open window, smoky and acrid, an odor so sharp it felt like it belonged to another world. Before we could even piece together what was happening, dizziness hit me, and I saw Anna slump to the side, grasping her throat, her eyes wide in alarm. Panic surged through me in a torrent, my mind racing with a single mantra: save her. My world shifted as I flailed under the weight of responsibility. I bolted outside, desperately calling for help, though the words felt caught in my throat, tangled in knots of fear. Neighbors emerged, concerned and confused, but as I waved my arms in frantic gestures, I saw their faces twist with suspicion and fear. I could feel it, the judgment laying itself across my shoulders like a mantle I hadn't asked for. In my desperation, I grabbed the nearest object, anything to emphasize the urgency of the situation, and clutched a garden spade, wielding it like a knight's sword. My tone shifted as I pointed it at a group of bystanders, accusing them of negligence, of failing to see what was unfolding, the potential catastrophe waiting to bloom before our eyes. The spade, a symbol of my misplaced fury, had become an instrument of chaos rather than salvation. I could hear Anna yelling my name, her voice a distant sound that strained to break through the fog of hysteria. In that moment of sheer panic and misplaced aggression, I had become the very thing I was trying to combat. How could I have lost myself like that? The guilt crashed over me like waves, drowning my sense of reason. Eventually, shouting sirens jolted everyone, and professionals swarmed the scene, taking control, but they had seen me, frantic and armed, the chaotic shadow of fear painted across my face. As they worked on Anna, my accusations lingered in the air like the remnants of that foul chemical that had thrown us into turmoil. I had turned from her protector to her accuser, my hands shaking not from the aftermath of the substance but from the realization of my brutality. We spent hours at the hospital, Anna recovering under the watchful eyes of medical staff. I sat in the waiting room, anxiously glancing at the clock, each tick mocking my inability to fix what I wrecked with mere words. I had to face her, face what I had done, confront the demons I had unleashed in my panic. When they finally summoned me into her room, I took a shaky breath, feeling unbearably small. Anna lay there, looking so fragile amid the hospital blankets, her face drawn but eyes still holding a flicker of defiance. I stumbled through an inadequate apology, each word seemed insipid compared to the reality of the night. I didn't mean for it to get that way, was all I could muster, fighting back the tears that stung my eyes. She just looked at me for a moment that felt like eternity, then asked the question that ripped through my heart: why did you turn on me? A question so piercing, I felt it carve itself into the very center of my being. I could have broken down right there, I could have explained how fear reshaped my mind, how the layers of security I felt crumbled when I saw her in distress, the confusion of not knowing if I could trust what my senses told me. But standing there, faced with the raw truth of my actions, I couldn't speak. Instead, I leaned forward, placing my head in my hands, my breath hitching with the weight of remorse I had been carrying. Seconds stretched into minutes, until I felt her hand on my back, a gentle reminder that despite everything, we were still together. The silence that followed held its own weight, both an apology and a question, an invitation to understand that sometimes the worst damage comes not from the hands that inflict harm but from the panic born from fear of losing someone you love. As we both sat in that fragile silence, we started to piece together our broken night. Anna shared her own fright, revealing how isolation and the feeling of abandonment in that chaotic moment tightened around her, just as my accusations had. Our hearts cracked open in the tender glow of understanding. There were shared fears and vulnerabilities that had twisted our perception that night, grief and paranoia woven into our bond. It was a moment of raw honesty, one that would not erase my actions but could potentially stitch up the wounds festering between us. We held on to that realization, fragile as it was, knowing that the shadows of our panic would remain part of our story, a brush with darkness that would ultimately guide us both closer to light. And now, standing outside in that stillness, I realize that the confession isn't about demonizing myself but about embracing the imperfections of love and fear. Admitting that we are both searching for absolution, not from the mistakes we make, but from the understanding that sometimes the horror lies in how we react when the ground beneath us gives way. Life, with all its fear and uncertainty, can bind us more tightly than we anticipate, leaving imprints we prefer to mask. But here, with my confession, I choose to confront rather than deny, sharing our tale as an unfinished thread, evidence of resilience in the heart of human frailty. I can't rewind the night, nor can I return the sharp edges of my accusations. Instead, I hope that in sharing this tale, we can both learn to navigate that fragile line between fear and love, tangled yet unbreakable, moving forward toward understanding one breath at a time. As I sit in the stillness of my dimly lit room, the hum of the street outside a distant reminder of life continuing in its usual course, I find myself drawn back to the events that transpired just hours ago, the night that transformed into a chaotic whirlwind of emotions fueled by panic and chemical memories. It all began innocuously enough, just another evening spent at home with Amy, my partner of 4 years, sharing our latest find on Netflix, laughter punctuating the cozy atmosphere, a glass of wine in each of our hands as the day's stresses seemed to dissipate into the flickering glow of the television screen. But then, around 10 o'clock, amid bites of popcorn and light-hearted banter, there was a strange knock at the door that shattered our bubble. I paused, my heart quickening. Something in that abrupt sound felt off, a sharp note that sent a cold shiver down my spine. Amy had exchanged a glance with me, one that I had now come to identify as the look of instinctual dread, her brow furrowed as she paused the show. We were both rooted in that moment, unspoken fears hanging in the air like static electricity. Who could that be at this hour? She whispered, her voice barely above a murmur, as I, against my better judgment, approached the door, hoping it was just a friendly neighbor or a late-night delivery. Instead, when I opened it, everything changed. A group of men, their faces half shrouded in hooded sweatshirts, stood there, eyes glistening with determination and perhaps something more sinister. Before I could fully process the situation, a sharp smell invaded my senses, something acrid and metallic, causing my throat to tighten as I started to choke. The next moments were a blur, shots of adrenaline blinding me as they shoved a canister into our home, releasing a thick mist that quickly enveloped the hallway, hanging heavily like a shroud between us and freedom. I felt dread creeping up my spine as I stumbled backward, and instinct took over. The first thought that flashed through my mind was to protect Amy at all costs. My heart raced, my breath came in frantic bursts, and while logic urged me to seek caution, panic swelled within me, drowning out my rationality. In the chaos, I rallied my thoughts to grab her hand, but the contorted expressions on the intruders' faces, hints of laughter that cut through my fear, ignited something darker within me. "Get out. We don't have anything for you," I screamed, words spilling out in a harsh, defensive growl that I barely recognized. I shoved a nearby plant pot toward them, a final desperate gesture, but as Amy screamed in disbelief, I could sense my own failure to protect her tearing at the edges of my sanity. In the haze of panic, I accused her in my heightened state, a horrible confession slipping from my lips that she should have done something, anything more to prepare us for an attack like this. As those words left me, I saw the hurt collect in her eyes, the reflection of my fears etching deeper scars into our bond. There, amidst the swirling chaos, I had not only welcomed danger but had turned on the one person I loved most in the world. The intruders fled soon after, seemingly sensing our vulnerability and choosing not to engage further, shadows moving quickly in the dark. The reality of the empty air left behind hit me with the force of a tidal wave. We were standing in our own safe space, a sanctuary that had violated what we believed to be true. I sank to my knees, the weight of my anger, confusion, and unbridled fear crashing hard against my chest. "I am so sorry," I breathed, my voice hoarse, but the words felt inadequate, nothing compared to the guilt that now lingered in the silence. I could see Amy standing there, framed in the low light, a silhouette of shock, fragile, trembling, as she drew away from me physically and emotionally, a chasm opening between us. I watched her retreat, each step marked not just by her physical distance but by the raw heartache that lay heavy between us, growing wider with each passing moment. It would be hours until we could delve into the ramifications of the night, but even in our attempts to regain some semblance of normalcy, I could hear the echoes of my accusations, the betrayal of fear twisting a bond forged through trust. When morning came, the sunlight crept through the curtains, bathing everything in a harsh reality I wished to escape. But I knew, in confronting the pain and uncertainty, we had the chance to rebuild. I lay in the silence beside her, each breath filled with an unbearable weight of regret and longing for reconciliation. I yearned to convey the agonizing truth that I had acted out of sheer terror, that in the throes of panic, I had shattered her sense of safety instead of protecting it. The road to healing would be fraught with difficult conversations, but from this raw wound, I hoped we could come to understand each other in ways we had not dared before. I finally nudged closer, seeking her warmth, craving forgiveness and connection because while fear may have tried to sever us, love held a capacity to mend, even the most fractured of hearts. Sharing this story doesn't erase the actions of last night, nor does it unravel the fateful words that spilled unbidden from my lips, but I hope that in opening this dialogue, we can better navigate our experiences together. As the sun cast our silhouettes against the wall, an unfinished painting, my heart swelled with cautious hope, the understanding that trust can be torn and frayed yet can come back together stronger, each thread weaving into the greater tapestry of our love. Walking that thin line between fear and love may forever be our journey, but perhaps, just perhaps, we would emerge more resilient together, each confession a path to healing, each misstep a step toward newfound understanding, intertwining as we move forward, one breath at a time. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the dim light of my living room felt a little too intimate for a solitary life, and I sat down to scroll through the endless feeds of social media, half-heartedly looking for something to entertain my weary mind when I stumbled upon an article titled "Nearly Half of U.S. Adults Say Dating Has Gotten Harder in the Last 10 Years." Curious and slightly amused, I clicked on it, my heart sinking a bit as a flood of familiar sentiments washed over me: frustration, loneliness, and an overwhelming sense of nostalgia for a simpler time. You see, I'm 32 now, and while I like to believe that I have a good sense of humor and a decent collection of interests, the past decade of dating had been anything but kind. Part of me wondered whether it was just me, navigating the turbulent waters of relationships, or if the currents had indeed shifted. I spent a few years in a serious relationship, only to unravel into a heap of missed opportunities and awkward Tinder messages after it ended, and as I read through the comments beneath the article, I saw reflections of my own struggles, faceless strangers sharing tales of ghosting, lousy pickups, and the hollow echo of a once vibrant dating scene. I thought about the last guy I dated, Mark, who had seemed so perfect on paper. Conversations flowed easily, we shared a love for bad puns and obscure 90s sitcoms, but then it unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck. There was confusion about commitment and future interests, and I remember the moment he casually mentioned that he didn't want to label what we had. I couldn't understand why such a simple phrase felt like someone had pulled the rug out from under me. The invisible connection we had was palpable, yet it seemed to tether him with a sense of dread. My thoughts spiraled, suffocating creative ideals of love and a warming trend of increasing expectations, unsolicited dating advice from friends who watched every swipe I took as if the stakes were life or death. The irony was that even as the pages of my dating life flipped with a quickened pace, I found myself more isolated than ever, existing in a modern world designed to connect but somehow bestowed with the weight of disconnection. Had we done this to ourselves? The virtual blooms of online dating were ghost towns after the initial swell of excitement faded. Swiping became an almost automated motion rather than an exploration of new meanings, and I truly felt baffled by the thought that perhaps love had turned into a fast food mentality, quick, inconsequential, and often unsatisfying. That night, as I slipped into bed surrounded by the soft hum of streetlights filtering through the curtains, I felt an unwavering sense of weariness but also a flicker of hope, wondering if there was a way to rediscover authentic connections. I recalled a conversation I had with my grandmother just a few weeks before, an endearing woman full of wisdom, who recounted her youth in a world where love letters were precious and meeting someone meant risking rejection, which somehow made the connection feel all the more profound. So, here I am, still pondering, still swiping cautiously, feeling the thorn of anxiety prick each time my phone buzzes with a new match. The complexity of finding someone who truly sees me, who values the depth of connection over the fleeting chase, leaves me with a soft determination. I refuse to believe that love is only wrapped in the aura of instant gratification. All of this led me to reflect on my own desires, to lay a foundation of honesty and vulnerability rather than attempting to navigate a maze of manufactured connections. Days later, in between work and a string of mundane social interactions, I sat down at a cafe, determined to write out the thoughts swirling in my mind. But I wasn't just writing. I opened a book on relationships, one of those infamous self-help titles that seemed to taunt me with glossed-over solutions. Suddenly, amidst the pages and coffee stains, I noticed something: a middle-aged couple, their hands intertwined, speaking softly to each other like old friends enjoying a quiet secret. In their presence, I felt something shift inside me, a reminder that love isn't just a mere game or fleeting moment. It is about the connections we nurture, the patience we exhibit, and the stories we share. As I walked out of the cafe that afternoon, the sun casting a warm light on my face, I felt less burdened. Instead of isolating my search for a partner, I was growing ever more committed to entering any future relationship with authenticity, willing to embrace the complexities, the messiness of human experience, and even the beautiful unpredictability that comes with being open to people who might not fit into neat little boxes. The dating scene may have changed, but perhaps it's also about taking a step back to truly figure out what I want and why I want it in the first place. It won't happen overnight. After all, meaningful connections take time. But as I continue to navigate this stubborn, evolving landscape of love, I find comfort in knowing that I am not alone, and maybe just maybe, that flicker of hope for something deeper is enough to keep my spirits alive. Update: a month later, after attending a small book club event to spark discussions around various love stories, I met Claire, a fellow book lover whose laughter felt like the first page to an unwritten narrative between us. We talked for hours, our conversation flowed as freely as the wine, weaving through ideas about relationships and the essence of connection, and for the first time in a long while, the spark felt genuine and eager, hinting at the possibility of crafting yet another story together, this time, one that embraces the complexities rather than shies away from them. Despite the promising start with Claire, I found myself perched on the precipice of doubt. As the days turned into weeks, I replayed our conversations in my mind. Convinced that the connection simmering beneath our shared words was fragile, like the spine of a well-loved book, creased and vulnerable. Our subsequent meetings felt charged with a mixture of thrill and trepidation. Intimate coffee dates morphed into long discussions of our personal narratives, each revealing a tapestry of past loves and heartbreaks. One afternoon, as we sat on a sun-dappled bench in the park, Claire shared stories of her previous relationships, how she once dated a musician who believed passion was an erratic flame that couldn't be contained, only invited in for fleeting moments. I admired her honesty, feeling a kinship in her vulnerability, and shared my own tales of sorrow that echoed her sentiments. It was cathartic, this exchange of rawness, yet it left me haunted by the nagging worry of my romantic ineptitude, that perhaps I had glimpsed the sun but felt unworthy of its warmth. I wanted to keep nurturing that newfound bond, but the fear of failure lingered, muddying my heart's waters. Then, one evening, after our book club discussions took a playful turn into what love stories truly entailed, Claire leaned closer and whispered, "What do you think is the most important trait in a partner?" I paused, taken aback as I felt the weight of her gaze pierce through my self-doubt. The truth hovered at the edge of my tongue, and suddenly, my heart was alive with purpose. Vulnerability, I found myself saying, the word smoothing over the anxiety knotting my stomach. It's essential to share your true self, flaws included. Claire nodded slowly, a smile spreading across her face as if the moment had cracked open an abstract painting between us. She was reflecting something I desperately wanted to believe, to be seen, truly seen, without the fear of scorn. That honesty shimmered through our subsequent encounters, leading us into new depths of connection. Yet, the road to this authenticity wasn't without potholes. I stumbled upon an old photo of my ex tucked away in my drawer, and the sudden swell of nostalgia pained me. I recalled the late-night texts, the joy we once shared, the way it all crumbled into misunderstandings and silence. That evening, with the remnants of our last date swirling in my mind, I found myself hesitating to message Claire, afraid that shadows of my past would taint what we had begun to craft. But the next day, I took a deep breath and reached out, asking her to talk over dinner. The moment I saw her smile, the tension in my chest eased just a little. I found myself sharing everything, the memories that haunted me and the way they colored my perspective on this new chapter. Claire listened, her compassionate eyes never wavering, and by the time I finished my story, I felt light, as though I had released a hidden weight. To my surprise, she opened up about her own past experiences, revealing troubled relationships that led to her insecurities, finding refuge in her love for literature that allowed her to escape. As she shared her truth, a sense of warmth enveloped us, binding our stories together and creating a safe harbor where vulnerability flourished. From that point on, we agreed to navigate our relationship as readers of an unwritten book, one where each chapter would be approached with honesty and mutual respect. Yet, as much as our connection grew stronger, I couldn't shake the feeling of inevitable change. It felt like waiting for the last page to turn. About a month later, as we strolled together through a local art fair, I sensed a shift, the air around us brimmed with anticipation. Claire paused before a canvas, her eyes captivated by the swirling colors. I watched as her expression transformed, finding beauty in the imperfections of the artwork, and suddenly the words slipped out, unplanned, "I'm falling for you." As soon as I said it, I felt my heart seize in desperation, but she turned to me, eyes wide with surprise, and then a grin spread across her face. "Good," she replied, her voice steady. "I think I might be falling for you, too." The palpable tension melted away as we stood together in that moment of shared revelation, our fears surrendering to the joy of the honesty we had forged, a connection that no longer felt like a fragile parchment but a tapestry rich with color and texture. As we moved from the art fair to the quiet of a nearby coffee shop, I couldn't help but feel the weight of my earlier concerns transforming into hope. Seating ourselves at a small table nestled in the corner, I looked into Claire's eyes, thinking how this moment felt like a new, thrilling chapter of our story. Weeks turned to months, and while we did face challenges, moments of miscommunication that sparked doubts or past insecurities surfacing like forgotten shadows, we learned to navigate them together. Late-night discussions became a routine, where we transformed frustrations into understanding, reminding ourselves that we were not only authors of our own stories but co-creators of this shared narrative, steering it forward with determination and love. Each step forward felt like a tiny victory, and with every encounter, the initial fear of commitment softened into a love that was no longer simplistic but beautifully complex. Reflecting on those early days, I now understand why there's a quote I once read that kept echoing in my mind: "Love, I learned, is not merely about finding the right one but about creating something right together, weaving memories into the very fabric of your shared existence." As I sit here, sipping coffee and writing this down, I realize I stumbled into what I had only hoped for, a love story shaped not by the echoes of past relationships but crafted from renewed hope, shared laughter, and an unwavering commitment to embrace the struggles of connection. Maybe dating had become complicated over the years, perhaps it had morphed into a labyrinth where many found themselves lost, but I finally learned that amid the confusion, there exists beauty, a beauty that envelops you in warmth when you allow yourself to be vulnerable. I'm not sure how this story will unfold, but for now, I'm grateful for every page that Claire and I continue to write together. As I close my laptop, I find peace in the thought that this narrative is still in progress, untouched and full of potential, just waiting for us to explore. Days turned into weeks, and what had begun as a simple conversation over the clinking of glasses at the book club evolved into a comfortable routine that both bewildered and delighted me. Claire and I would trade texts in the morning, each one an invitation to another lively debate, another shared thought that blossomed into broader horizons. We explored quaint coffee shops filled with the scent of freshly ground beans, sat in bustling libraries among dusty tomes, and strolled through leaf-strewn parks as autumn draped its colors around us. It amazed me how easily the words fell between us, how despite the complex layers of dating I had previously navigated, the connection with Claire felt refreshingly straightforward, refreshing like the crisp, cool air of a fall evening. We thrived in our discussions about literature, love, and the intricate dance of human relationship dynamics, often laughing at the misadventures we faced in our past romances. But as magical as our budding romance felt, I couldn't shake the gnawing shadow of my insecurities. After years of confusion and disappointments in the dating scene, I found myself plagued by moments of doubt. What if this was all too good to be true? What if Claire's laughter was merely a beautiful prelude to louder, harsher realities? One evening, we found ourselves huddled up on my couch, 2 mugs of chamomile steaming between us as the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon. It was soft and intimate, the kind of moment that felt like it should be framed and hung on a wall. Suddenly, as we trailed off from a conversation about character arcs, I felt that familiar discomfort wash over me. "Claire," I began, my voice uncertain, "I don't want to scare you or ruin what we have, but I need to share something." The warmth in her eyes dimmed slightly, just enough to tell me I had pricked the veneer of our cozy evening. "What is it?" she asked gently, her attention entirely on me. I took a breath, summoning courage. "I guess I'm wondering how you see this, us. I've struggled with connection, and I can't help but feel hesitant. What if I mess it up?" A moment of silence stretched between us, and I held my breath, weaving through my fears and waiting for her response. Claire placed her mug down and leaned forward, her expression serious yet kind. "You know, I've felt that too," she admitted softly, her honesty disarming me. "The last few dates I had weren't what I hoped they'd be either, leaving me feeling like I was just going through the motions. But this, what we have, it doesn't feel like anything I've experienced before. It feels comfortable, yes, but also thrilling. I'm not in a rush. I want to explore this with you." I let out a sigh of relief, realizing that vulnerability had granted me more than I expected. As the conversation meandered once again, I felt a weight lift. The beauty lay not in certainty, but in the fluidity of our development together, our stories intertwining like chapters of a well-loved book. Throughout the next few weeks, I learned to appreciate our gentle unraveling of connection. We embarked on small adventures, wandering farmers' markets, engaging in light-hearted debates over dinner, and letting time stretch blissfully as we discovered new layers to one another. With each shared glance, each brush of fingers, something inside me shifted. I began to revel in the present moment instead of living in fear of its potential future endings. But just as it often happens in life, as tranquility painted over our days, shadows from the past crept in. One chilly night, Claire confided her own horizon of past heartbreaks, an agonizing relationship riddled with betrayal and secrets that had once left her questioning her own worth. I listened intently, hoping she could find solace in my presence, reflecting on how we, too, had been shaped by our own struggles. It was surreal, a powerful moment where two narratives fused, echoing each other's pain but just as equally, reassuring hope. When our fingers intertwined that night, the connection felt electric yet grounded, a reminder that we were two people choosing to step into the vulnerability together, reaffirming the beauty and honesty in shared healing. There was no way to predict how our ongoing story would unfold. Rather, I learned to savor the chapters we continued to write, open to the unexpected plot twists that might emerge along the way. As the cold months passed into blooming spring, our comfort transitioned to laughter and light-hearted banter that filled our encounters with an even deeper affection. Then one evening, just as the sun began its descent into a vibrant orange hue, Claire pulled a book from her bag. It was The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, a tapestry of journeying and fate. She had read it several times but wanted to explore it with me. As we settled onto a park bench with the world around us fading into a gentle melody of birds chirping and children laughing, we delved into the themes that unraveled in each chapter, sharing perspectives, dreams, and our own losses. I could see how each narrative spoke to the idea of pursuing your personal legend, laying bare the truth that sometimes, the greatest story we can write is the one woven through the connection we forge with another. Claire's laughter erupted as we climbed higher into our discussions about destiny, fear, and the courage to love. It felt right to be there, and I marveled at how lifted I felt amongst the blooms of cherry blossoms. While the past may have forced me to walk through a maze of trials, it led me to this moment, surrounded by the woman who didn't feel like I was merely worthy of love but, instead, someone who had become a beautiful story I couldn't wait to keep writing. Life would inevitably throw its challenges our way, but what I learned was that as we navigated this journey together, the real weight lay in our capacity to embrace the uncertainty while continuing to choose each other, to be each other's anchors. As I hold on to this thought, I let it resonate in the quiet of the evening, knowing we were ready to write the next pages of our lives, unrushed and open, just like a beautifully unfolding book waiting to share its finest secrets. The day had started like any other, with the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft tapping of keyboards providing a familiar soundtrack to our small IT office. I had settled into my routine, seated in front of my dual monitors, running through the usual set of tasks, system updates, routine checks, and the occasional support ticket from distressed coworkers. The office was quiet, almost soothing, with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air, but that peace shattered the moment I saw him walk through the door. It was Phil, our CEO's longtime friend, a man whose connection to the top rung of the corporate ladder made us all uneasy. He strode in without so much as a hello, an aura of entitlement surrounding him like a cloud. His casual demeanor clashed with the sternness of his pronouncement. He demanded full access to our systems. A knot of dread formed in my stomach at his request, not just because it felt inherently wrong, but because I had witnessed the fallout of giving access to those who didn't understand the responsibility that came with it. I exchanged glances with my coworker, Sarah, whose eyes mirrored my concern. We both knew that security protocols were put in place for a reason. Phil, I managed, trying my best to maintain a calm exterior, I'm afraid we can't grant the kind of access without proper clearance and justification. He scoffed, running a hand through his tousled hair, dismissing my hesitance with a wave like I was a mere inconvenience in his day. Come on, you're not seriously going to make this harder, are you? It's just a little access, you should lighten up. I could feel my palms grow clammy at his words, that creeping mix of anxiety and moral indignation swirling inside me. I was caught in the turmoil of knowing that defying him could have consequences, not just for my career, but for the integrity of our systems. I took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, striving to steady my racing heart. Phil, there are rules for a reason. If you need access, there's a process to follow. The tension in the room thickened, and I could sense Sarah urging me with wide eyes to let it go, to just bow to the request so we could pass this awkward moment. But I couldn't shake the foreboding feeling that allowing this was opening a door to something far darker than mere technicalities. He folded his arms, his expression hardening, but I stood my ground, my voice unwavering as I reiterated the importance of safeguarding our data. Days passed, and I thought that perhaps it had blown over, until I received a cryptic email late one evening. It was from an unfamiliar account but bore his name as the subject line. Confusion set in as I opened it to find a list of usernames and passwords, seemingly random data points, and a note that read, "I'm relying on you to fulfill our deal. Access your systems and provide me what I need. You know where to find me." Cold panic washed over me. What had I stumbled into? Was it just a ploy to cover something up, or was it truly innocent? I felt trapped between my desire to be loyal to my employer and protect our work while also wanting to shield myself from consequences I could hardly predict. In the end, I made a decision that I feared I would always look back on. I reached out to my manager, who was out of office at the time, but I felt the weight of my choice grow heavier with each hour until he replied with a firm no. We were headed into a meeting to discuss security protocols the very next day, and I shared everything with him. Shock flickered across his face as he scrolled through the email. "We're shutting this down immediately," he said decisively, leaving me halfway relieved and halfway terrified. Phil was furious when he learned of my decision, of our refusal to comply, and summoned for a confrontation. It felt like a weight had been lifted as I faced him, the cloud of guilt dissipating, replaced by the solidarity of my coworkers and management standing behind me. He raged and fumed, trying to appeal to our sense of loyalty, our ambitions, but we held firm, knowing that allowing this would compromise everything we had worked for. "I trusted you," he spat at me, and the words cut like a knife, but I took solace in the fact that I could move forward knowing I did the right thing. The next week saw Phil removed from his associations with the company, a casualty of his own hubris. The office felt lighter without him, but I remained cautious, scanning every email and request for any lingering signs of potential fallout. Looking back, I realize it was a turning point, a moment that reshaped my understanding of trust and integrity in the workplace. As for an update? Well, here's where it gets even stranger. I found out later that Phil was mixed up in something far deeper than I realized, something involving data breaches and concerns that had the higher-ups scrambling to secure our network even tighter than before. So in that sense, I guess I did save the day. But who knows? I'm still grappling with the reality that sometimes in the pursuit of loyalty, one needs to question everything, even friends of the most powerful, and I can't shake the feeling that I might have dodged a bullet that day. As I sat at my desk, the soft hum of the office around me felt comforting yet ominous in light of what transpired. It had been a week since that fateful day when Phil, my CEO's friend, had stormed in, arrogance percolating from every pore as he demanded unrestricted access to our systems. I had handled the situation with a calmness I hardly believed I was capable of, but the aftermath hummed like a low-frequency alarm in the back of my mind. Each day I returned to the office felt like a tightrope walk, balancing my job security against the nagging thought of Phil's motives. I remember sitting with my colleague, Sarah, over lunch, the two of us trading stories while the taste of lukewarm coffee swirled around my cup. I looked up at her, seeking solace in familiarity, and asked, "Do you think it's really just about Phil wanting to check in on his buddy's company?" Her brow furrowed, and she bit into her sandwich as if stalling for time. "I don't know, Mike. It sounds like he wanted something much bigger than access. You have to trust your instincts." She flashed a conspiratorial smile, but her voice held a weight that lingered in the nuances of our conversation. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, struggling to shake the sense of impending dread that clung to me like a shadow. The digital landscape I had navigated through my career, once a realm of puzzles and systems, now felt starkly dangerous, like a labyrinth with no exit. My mind raced back to the way Phil had leaned over my shoulder, his eyes wide with a disturbing kind of gleeful curiosity as I hesitated. It wasn't just a request, it was a command cloaked in charm, and that realization gnawed at me. Was I right to refuse him? I spent hours reanalyzing the CEO's likely discomfort with such a blatant breach. Was my loyalty to my company, and my moral judgment, sufficient to stave off whatever dark currents Phil harbored? The days turned into a montage of anxiety, each muted conversation in the office paired with potential repercussions of my actions. I saw Phil's face invade my thoughts during quiet moments, blurred in the background like a face of a clock I desperately wished to reset. As the following weeks unfolded, I noticed strange patterns, missed calls from various officials trying to reach Phil, the abrupt tightening of our security protocols, and whispers through the grapevine about a mysterious investor pulling out of a significant project. My heart sank when I came across a hacker forum late one evening, images floating by of exposed data breaches that unnervingly mirrored our own systems. Each headline carried the weight of the unknown, and somewhere beneath that certainty, I began to understand that I had unknowingly become part of a larger story riddled with deception and betrayal. Maybe I had been granted a moment of clarity when I denied Phil access, or perhaps, I had just plunged myself into deeper waters. I could have been swimming alongside a potential monster. Instead, I had steered clear. Every so often, I would glance towards the conference room where Phil's presence lingered in phantom echoes, wondering if we'd see him again, and if so, which version would be through the door, the charming friend or the potential threat. As days melted into weeks, I felt a weight lift ever so slightly, as if I had donned iron armor instead of the corporate cloak I'd worn every day. One afternoon, while I stopped by reception, fate, the universe, or maybe just bad coffee, conspired against me. As I turned toward the entrance, an unfamiliar tension bridged the air, causing me to freeze when a figure emerged from the elevator. It was Phil, flanked by two men in sharply tailored suits, all too aware of the eyes glued to them. Instinctively, I stepped back into the shadows, my breath caught in my throat. My heart raced as I caught snippets of their conversation, sharp whispers slicing through the air like glass. My mind raced, the part of me that believed I was watching something unfold mixed with the part that wanted to flee. I leaned closer, carefully inching to eavesdrop, desperate to piece together this puzzle I thought had already revealed its face. "We need the access. The board is getting jittery," one of the men remarked, his tone devoid of warmth. "Your friend's been making waves I'd rather avoid." "We'll get what we need, just not through that particular door," Phil laughed, but it lacked any richness. "Those techies live in fear, just mention my name, and they'll scramble to please." A swell of realization hit me. Phil wasn't just a charming friend, he was a manipulator. The encounter pulled back the velvet curtain I had hesitated long to unravel. As they turned to leave, I was struck by a vicious wave of adrenaline. Suddenly, I understood my responsibility. It wasn't just about protecting our data, it was about safeguarding us all from the potential peril Phil represented. That evening, shaken yet resolute, I walked straight into my manager's office, recounting every detail I had overheard. Their eyes widened, and in that moment, I felt the weight of trust settle onto my shoulders with an enormity I couldn't ignore. The investigation that followed soon revealed layers to Phil's involvement that I had meticulously unearthed, and soon enough, the air at the office shifted from unease to renewed vigor as my colleagues rallied together. I learned that sometimes the bonds formed in the corporate world aren't as straightforward as they seem, and loyalty becomes a dual-edged sword, cutting through the mist of what was mere friendship to a murky underbelly of ambition and unresolved karma. The road to recovery for our company was lengthy, marked by security audits and sleepless nights, but as months passed, I felt gratitude seep through, a reminder that by trusting my instincts, I had steered clear of a treacherous undercurrent. So, here we are, standing at the precipice of newfound awareness, and while the heaviness of Phil's actions lingers behind us, I step forward unburdened, each day a chance to rebuild, reflect, and reclaim a piece of the innocence that once defined my work. And yes, in this odd journey of corporate twists and questionable loyalties, I've learned that sometimes, a single moment's hesitation can be the difference between chaos and clarity. The journey ahead seemed uncertain, yet I found solace in the routine, a comfort in the familiar. I remapped my landscape at work, investing my energy into projects that restored trust, not just with my team, but within myself. Each morning, I arrived at the office with a renewed purpose, greeting colleagues with genuine smiles and open conversations, hoping to cultivate an environment where honesty outshone the shadows of betrayal. Little things began to change. The light banter over coffee breaks turned into brainstorming sessions about cybersecurity measures, bridging gaps that had formed in our wake of suspicion. I knew this wasn't just about protecting our systems anymore, it was about building a fortification of camaraderie, one fortified with shared knowledge rather than whispered fears. Phil's absence echoed through the dimly lit halls of the office. I would catch the occasional mention of him in hushed voices or see glances exchanged over lunch, but it was as if he had become a ghost, haunting yet intangible. My gut had screamed at me during his visit, a dire warning that felt far too instinctual to ignore. I could now reflect with clarity, grateful that I had stood my ground. Yet, memories of our once harmless exchanges lingered, the laughter and camaraderie we shared, creating an unsettling juxtaposition against the malicious actions I had uncovered. And sometimes, late at night, when the hum of my computer quieted down and the office had long emptied, doubts would creep in, taunting me with what-ifs. What if I'd been wrong? What if my immediate judgment had cost Phil a chance to redeem himself? But with each passing week, the dread eased, and a surprising friendship blossomed with Jess, our new cybersecurity analyst. She brought in an air of enthusiasm that was infectious, balancing my dark musings with her lighthearted wit. One evening, while working late to refine a presentation for our next team meeting, we found ourselves wrapped in conversation about resilience and trust. The way she recounted stories of corporate misdeeds, her voice laced with a mix of humor and frustration, reminded me that I wasn't alone in navigating this gauntlet. People can be unpredictable, she said, her fingers tapping away, bringing up statistics on another data breach attempt that had emerged that very week. But the beauty of it is learning to adapt. You learn to protect yourself, navigate those waters. Her words resonated with me, and I couldn't help but smile, appreciating how innate her perspective seemed, refreshing amidst the turmoil I had faced. Time flowed, and the routine of our work settled in, punctuated by updates on network security measures and a few unnecessary corporate meetings that felt like a labyrinth with no end. Gradually, I discovered that Phil had been discreetly sending out feelers, trying to return to good graces with the company and some of my coworkers through casual lunches and goodwill gestures. My emotions pulled in ridiculous directions. On one side was the anger for what he'd done, the way he had endangered something we had built together. On the other side, an odd sympathy for someone who felt like a friend and an ally until the truth tumbled down like a shattered mirror. And then came the day when my assumptions would be challenged yet again. I stepped out for an uneventful lunch, but fate decided to intervene. I just raised my fork, ready for a small battle with a sandwich, when I spotted him across the street. Phil, in a well-tailored suit but with an air of dishevelment that suggested he had not been sleeping well, appeared more gaunt than I remembered. I hesitated, my heartbeat quickening, not out of anger, but turmoil. I could feel the remnants of compassion creeping in, battling against the memories of treachery. Should I approach? Or was it simply too far gone? The tides of time ebbed and flowed around me as I wrestled with my feelings, caught in a storm of potential confrontation. Ultimately, curiosity overpowered my trepidation. I set my sandwich down, took a deep breath, and crossed the street, finding myself standing in front of him, heart pounding in my chest. The fleeting expression on his face flickered between surprise and vulnerability, and for a moment, the bitterness of the past was suspended in the charged atmosphere around us. "Hey," I forced out, a word loaded with years of complexity, "can we talk?" His eyes widened, and as he nodded, I silently realized that perhaps this moment, this conversation, could be a bridge to healing for both of us, or at the very least, a way to let go of some lingering weight. We stood there, two figures at the crossroads of our making, ready to engage in a dialogue that might just reshape our understanding of trust and the shadows that lurked in corporate corridors. Whether it would lead to one step forward or a spiral into chaos, only time would tell, but as I looked into his eyes, I felt ready to face whatever he would throw my way, hoping it would come with clarity, for both our sakes.